And this morning I'd like to welcome Dr. Rob Stoneman, who's the area coordinator for Rewilding Europe. Just a bit of background about Rob. He has a PhD in the ecology of peat. I think that's right, Rob.
Yeah.
He did a lot of field work for this in Borneo, of all places. But one of my lasting images of Rob, he's an old friend and former boss of mine, the memory of Rob striding across the island of Lewis in the peat bog, absolutely in a world of his own. And he is a real peat enthusiast. He joined Scottish Wildlife Trust and then subsequently became director of Hampshire Wildlife Trust, and most recently was the chief exec of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, which is how I know Rob. And he expanded their membership and their reserves hugely, and started some very special projects, including the Yorkshire Peat Project and the Yorkshire Living Seas Project, which is why he's of great relevance to us. So without more ado, and hopefully no more dropouts, I'd like to hand over to Rob.
Great, thank you very much, Martin. Okay, super. Okay, so as Martin explained, I work for Rewilding Europe, which is a charity to promote rewilding across the whole of Europe, and we're involved in many different landscapes across Europe. But as Martin said, my background is with the British Wildlife Trust, so and still have a bit of a heart in the Wildlife Trusts. What I'm going to talk about today is obviously rewilding. I want to go through how this concept came about, how we define it, why we think it's such a massive opportunity for Europe and effectively a new narrative for nature conservation. And then what I really want to do is to kind of showcase rewilding around Europe, some of the big areas that we're working in, and then just finish with some critical messages, including a bit of a taster for a National Geographic series that is being run at the moment. So hopefully you can, if you've got access to that, you can understand a lot more about this. So let's start with how rewilding came about. And this chap here, Robert Payne, he's an American scientist. He worked up in the Pacific Northwest coast. And he's kind of sort of godfather of rewilding. And he ran a simple experiment. So he said, well, what would happen if we had with two rock pools, so both on the same piece of beach, and we take the starfish out of one rock pool. The reason he wanted to take the starfish out is he recognized that the starfish were, in effect, the mega herbivore of those particular rock pools. So as you would know, starfish are amazing creatures. They have their stomach inside, and they invert it over the crustacean, pull the crustacean into their stomachs, crush it, excrete the shell, and eat the nutrients. So he conducted this experiment, and something quite interesting happened. So the pool where the starfish were taken out, I guess not surprising, that the crustaceans that the starfish were feeding on started to expand in numbers because they weren't being predated in the same way, and in particular the mussels really started to get a hold on this rock pool. And after a year or so, the mussel population had expanded so much it had taken every single available piece of rock space in the rock pool, and it had effectively outcompeted all the other crustaceans. And so the biodiversity of that rock pool started to collapse, and the number of species that were in that rock pool started to collapse. So in terms of the crustacean species, they went from, I think it was about 20 species to just 9 species over just a year, just by removing the top level predator. And it kind of fits to a concept that John Muir was talking about back in the 19th century. John Muir was a famous explorer that effectively set up the national park system in the USA. And he said, if you tug at any one piece of nature, the universe tends to unravel. So, in effect, what Robert Payne was doing here was tugging away at a part of the nature, really important part of the nature of that rock pool, and unraveling the universe of the rock pool. But what happens if you did the other way around? So at Yellowstone National Park, some years ago, back in the 90s, the park managers there decided that they would reintroduce one of the lost species of Yellowstone. So like in many parts of Europe and America, wolves have been extirpated or exterminated because of obviously predating cattle and sheep and so on. and there were concerns that, that wolves were predating the elk and the moose in Yellowstone, even in the 1960s. So they were completely removed. So in the 1990s, the Park Rangers Service decided that they would reintroduce wolves, which is just a very straightforward reintroduction project. But something quite spectacular happened, something that they didn't expect. And we can call it the ecology of fear. So the wolves started to predate on elk, no big surprise, or moose as well. And these elk and moose were particularly grazing the riverbanks, very lush vegetation on the riverbanks, so they were found there typically. But if you're being predated by wolves, it's better to have a 360-degree escape route rather than a 180-degree escape route you have by the river. So under this ecology of fear, it's not that the elk numbers reduced particularly. Wolves don't eat that many elks. It's that they stopped grazing along the riverbanks. They went away from the riverbanks. And then because of that, the vegetation started to grow back along the riverbanks. And you got the big tree species, so the oak, alder, willow, sallow, all those kind of species. And that in turn was pretty good for the beavers. So there were beavers in Yellowstone, but at fairly low numbers. But the beavers suddenly had a much better food source along the riverbanks. So they started to expand in numbers. And of course, beavers are ecosystem engineers in their own right, started to build dams on the river system. So the beavers started to build the dams, and they created these small wetlands. And suddenly the floodplain started to reconnect to the stream, creating a whole nother set of diversity. But not only that, is that those little dammed up streams now meant that you had this system of pools and riffles starting to redevelop. So rather than a sort of single gradient, you had a stepped gradient down the river system, which means that between the dams, you get faster flow. And that cleaned out the silt, recreated the gravel beds. And of course, these gravel beds are really important for salmon breeding. And salmon like to breed they leave their eggs in these fast flowing gravels. Because they're highly oxygenated and so on. And so the salmon population started to increase. It increased rapidly to the point where, in fact, salmon, which are fantastic for bears because the bears eat salmon when they come up to spawn, they eat salmon. It's a really important part of their diet because it's just before they hibernate where they're really trying to put fat reserves on. And so the bear population expanded. The wolves also killed coyotes and reduced the coyote population, which increased the fox and the rodent population. So in every single way, that the reintroduction of just one animal, the wolf, created what we call a trophic cascade of effect. The species suddenly exploded across the whole of the Yellowstone ecosystem. So another example is this return of lost megafauna to the Siberian plains. So what we can see is that at the beginning of the Holocene, what we think was the situation was that Europe, Eurasia, in fact, all of the continents of the world were dominated by these mega herbivores. So in Europe, it would have been things like wild cattle, wild bison, European bison, wild horses, deer, and so on. And when humans returned to the northern parts of these continents, so into Northern Europe, into Northern Asia, what happened is that these animals had not evolved particularly with humans. They're slow moving, they're very easy to hunt, and humans started to massacre them in numbers. So in that very early Holocene period, during the Mesolithic of human civilization, you had this overkill philosophy where we were herding animals off cliffs and things like that. And it actually led to the extinction of many of the mega herbivores. So we lost, for example, the woolly mammoths and cave bears in Northern Europe, and so on. And you can see that the timing of that effect is essentially in line with when humans come in. So in Europe, this happened a long time ago, about 12,000 years ago. In Siberia, where the ice left a little bit later, it happened about 5,000 years ago. If we go on to Wrangel Island, which was only inhabited by humans about 3,000 years ago, we still had woolly mammoths. Imagine woolly mammoths on islands in Siberia just 3,000 years ago, exterminated by humans. We lost much of the mega herbivore fauna in North America again in the early Holocene, although the final extirpation of the mega herbivores didn't happen until Europeans came in with the wipeout of the bison, the buffalo herds in North America, so only a couple of hundred years ago. And arguably in Africa, that process of mega herbivore removal is actually happening now. And there's an argument that because mega herbivores evolved with humans in Africa, that's where we came from, they've lasted a lot longer. So back to Siberia, there's an idea that maybe we should return some of the lost megafauna into the Siberian plains. And this has been trialed in a place called Pleistocene parks, this idea of getting back some of the Pleistocene flora. And again, a very interesting effect happens. So the vegetation of Siberia today, this is north of the taiga forest, is mainly moss and low shrub. It's quite dark vegetation. It absorbs sunlight in the summer months, which means that the top layer of the permafrost melts, allows vegetation to grow. But of course, you don't want the whole of the permafrost to melt, because that would be catastrophic in terms of climate change, because the permafrost soils store huge amounts of methane, which is a particularly virulent greenhouse gas. And what they found is that the return of the mega herbivores started to, through trampling and through grazing, start to change that mossy, shrubby vegetation into a much grassier vegetation. And you can see it here in the picture, and it's much lighter, and it reflects the sunlight back in the summer, and that keeps that permafrost layer frozen. And that could be absolutely crucial in terms of some of these positive feedback effects. So there was a paper written looking at, can we return mega herbivores to the whole of the Siberian system to stop that positive feedback effect happening, which could be really catastrophic. So another example of rewilding a bit closer to home here in Europe, this is in the Netherlands, and this is on a place called Oostvaardeplassen, which is a polder, so been reclaimed from the sea by building seawalls, pumping the seawater out, and it was going to be developed into industry in the late 1960s. But because of the oil price shock in the early 70s, the industry never happened. The polder was effectively abandoned, and it became a pretty good bird watching site. So you started to see that succession of vegetation that you would typically understand. So you would see the grasses coming in, and then the shrub coming in, and eventually that shrub would be succeeded by trees. You would eventually get closed canopy woodland. So that's the classic vegetation succession. And what a famous Dutch ecologist saw was that succession wasn't taking place, and it wasn't taking place because of geese. This site had huge numbers of geese, and they were effectively grazing down the grasslands and stopping that succession of shrub to forest and so on. And so Franz Vera postulated that actually, if we think about the Holocene overkill ideas of mega herbivores across Europe, that actually it was likely that Europe wasn't closed canopy woodland. This idea that a red squirrel could bounce its way across the treetops from Latvia to southern Spain was probably not the case. That in fact, before humans really modified the landscape, those forests would probably have been pretty open, because within those forests would have been the mega herbivore fauna. So there would have been European bison, wild cattle, wild horses, many deer, and so on. And in fact, the populations of those animals would be very much, as you see in the savannah, very much defined about the weather. And so in droughty times where there wouldn't be enough food, or in very harsh winters where there's not enough food, the populations would reduce, the forests would recover, and in more amenable times, the populations would get very high. It'd be more open forest, and it would boom and bust. So he set that experiment up. He reintroduced into Oostvaardeplassen wild cattle. He used they're extinct wild cattle, so he used an equivalent called hek cattle. He introduced wild horses, again extinct, so he used an equivalent, conic ponies, and he reintroduced red deer. And what he saw was that, yes, indeed, the numbers started to increase, in fact, and they started browsing out of the woodlands and creating the glacier exactly as he postulated. Unfortunately, that experiment never got to the end, because in the inevitable harsh winter that came, and animals started to starve. I mean, this site is about 10 miles away from Amsterdam, so understandably, for animal welfare reasons, it was just deemed unacceptable. So they started to cull the animals rather than allow that boom and bust cycle to happen. But nevertheless, what it showed is that the mega herbivores absolutely changed the ecosystem, and the term rewilding started to develop. In fact, this concept was then taken forward in a remarkable program of flood defense that the Dutch engineers ran from about 1990 up to date. And essentially, so they had floods in the 80s that were devastating. So these are floods from the River Rhine. It's when you get high levels of snowmelt and lots of rainfall. And the Rhine then bursts its banks, and you can see some of the devastating effects of that, and indeed loss of life even in Holland in the 1980s. And so Dutch engineers decided, well, they could either build massive walls in the cities to protect the cities from this sort of flooding, which would be expensive and unsightly, and it would effectively cut the urban population away from the river, or they could do something a little bit more sensible, which was to use floodplains. And I love the idea that it's radical to use a floodplain to store floodwaters, because of course that's what they've been doing naturally for thousands of years before we cut the rivers off from our floodplains. And so they used the floodplains, and so they actually bought the farmers out. So the Dutch state said to all the farmers, said to the farmers in the floodplain, what we're going to do is we're going to buy land elsewhere. We're going to swap your farm if you're amenable to that. And eventually they could take control of the whole floodplain, and they pulled the dikes back and allowed that floodplain to flood. And of course, once it's allowed to flood, it's flooding very regularly in the Dutch case in springtime. And it's not really suitable for agriculture. So what do you do with that? So what they started to think about was, let's use some of these rewilding techniques that have been practiced at Oostvaardersplassen and start to introduce those into the Dutch floodplain system, simply because it's a much, much cheaper way of managing the land. But it started to have effects that they didn't quite realize would happen. So, I guess as Frans Vera predicted, you started to see forest glades starting to develop, woodland areas developing, tightly grazed pastures in other places, wallows that were so the animals were creating these kind of mud hollows and wallows, which then turned into ephemeral ponds. Even at very low river flow, so late summer, the sand started to blow in from the river bottom, blow onto the floodplain, and create inland sand dunes, which were probably always a feature of floodplains. We can see sand deposits all over the UK, and these inland sand dunes obviously create another set of diversity. And you started to see a massive comeback of wildlife. So white-tailed sea eagles, came back on their own into these floodplains. Massive numbers of warblers, and even wolves returning from through Germany and into the Netherlands, and settling into the Netherlands because of these rewilded floodplains. And they're very extensive. So with hundreds of kilometres of river valley being rewilded. In the UK, this very famous example is on the Knepp estate. It's in Sussex in southern England. And here was a farm, a typical arable and mixed farm, dairy farm, on the very heavy clay Wilden soils. In fact, so heavy, these soils, that only 2 out of every 3 years did they actually make a profit. And eventually the owners, the boroughs, said, oh, look, this is crazy. We're not actually making any money from this. It's hard work. Can we take a different approach? And inspired by being on safari in Africa, they eventually decided to stop farming. They put a ring fence around the whole area, and then they used some of these rewilding techniques that they'd learned about from people like Frans Vera. And they started to reintroduce the lost megafauna of the UK. I mean, how exciting, for the first time in the UK. So they reintroduced wild boar. Well, they weren't allowed to introduce wild boar under the Dangerous Animals Act, so they used a proxy. So they introduced Tamworth pigs as a primitive breed of pigs. They introduced wild cattle. Again, they're extinct, so they used another proxy. So they used a primitive breed, British Longhorn cattle. Wild horses, again, extinct, so they used Exmoor ponies as our primitive breed of horses. And there were red deer in Knepp already, and roe deer's numbers. There's no predators in the UK, of course. There's no wolves, no bears. So these animals are culled every so often to keep the numbers in check. And you can see the sort of impact that it had on the habitat. But again, something quite amazing happened. So suddenly, out of nowhere, purple emperor butterfly appeared, which is incredibly rare, but I've seen it in France. I've never seen it in the UK. And it's considered to be a butterfly of high oak woodlands. You find them in the New Forest, for example. And they suddenly appeared, feeding on sallow. And it turns out that purple emperor are only in those high oak forest woodlands because that's the last place. It's not actually good habitat for them. It's just the last place that they can exist in. So purple emperor turned up, but not just a few purple emperor, the biggest purple emperor population in southern England. Turtle dove, 99% decline of this bird in the UK. It's virtually extinct. And again, at Knepp, in this rewilded landscape, it started to breed, not only started to breed, again, the biggest population of turtle doves breeding in southern England, and exactly the same for nightingales. So again, nightingale virtually lost from southern England. There's certainly no nightingales seen in Berkeley Square. And again, we get the biggest population of nightingales in southern England, all on this rewilded estate. I mean, just incredible. And you know, to take the purple emperor example, it was the pigs wallowing in burrowing the way through the soil, creating the conditions for sallow to grow. It turns out that sallow is a really good food source for the caterpillars, which is why the purple emperor population exploded on there. So there's some examples of how sort of rewilding came about, and you can see some themes coming out of there. So this first theme is about trophic complexity in keystone species, you know, and you know, we saw that in the wild boar creating the sallows to create the purple emperors, or the wolves at Yellowstone changing creating that ecology of fear. And you can see the same at sea. So the big animals, so the big keystone species, things like blue whales or fin whales, or the really big predators, fish predators like tuna, have been mainly lost from British waters. And you get this enormous cascade of different effects through these keystone species. So that's the first theme, trophic complexity. The second theme in this picture is around disturbance, about natural processes or natural processes of disturbance. So if you just take this picture, this is a picture of the River Nethy. It runs through RSPB Abernethy Reserve in northern Scotland. And it's a river that you hardly see in the UK anymore, because nearly all of our rivers have been in some way modified by us. So you can see here, there's a landslide down the steep slope there. You've got a lightning hole. You've got a lot of dead wood all over the place. That landslide has created a whole load of sediment that's now changing the river dynamics. So you've got pools and riffles being created and so on. And we saw in our other examples, we saw sand dunes being created on the River Rhine, floodplains, beaver dams being created through the ecology of fear, and so on. And all of these natural processes, these disturbance processes, create diversity, create niches for that cascade of wildlife to come into. The third theme is around dispersal. And that species depend on an ability to disperse, not least if there's some sort of issue where you are. So if you look at this picture, you know, this is in the Southern Carpathians in Romania, and you can see some of the meadows here, and you can see, you know, some fantastic wildlife, absolutely gorgeous. But the really key thing about this picture is that forest, that beautiful old growth beech and spruce forest stretching out in front of you, stretches for 1,500 kilometers. Absolutely vast connected forest area along the Carpathian chain, through Romania, through Poland, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, and so on. So, you know, fantastic. And it's no wonder that within that connected habitat, you still have big animals like wolves and bears, just fantastic. So if we start to put all of those themes together, you get this kind of theoretical framework. And you can see that in the top left here. There's this theoretical framework published in the paper in Science last year. And it talks about trophic complexity, which means lots and lots of different species. It talks about stochastic disturbance. We never know what stochastic means, but I think it means random disturbances. So these natural processes that allow diversity to happen. And it talks about that dispersal. So if you take a species like the red-backed shrike, this was a common breeding bird in southern England, in places like Devon, not that long ago. And it's now extinct from the UK as a breeding bird. And it's extinct because we just don't have all of those different elements in place. We don't have the trophic complexity. We've lost our mega herbivores. We've extirpated our big predators, and we're gradually reducing trophic complexity through intensive agriculture, for example. We don't have those connected habitats on land anymore. We have small nature reserves and small woodlands that are disconnected from each other. And we certainly don't allow natural processes to happen. We've disconnected our rivers from our floodplains. We don't allow landslides to happen, and so on. We see fire as a problem in the landscape rather than as a positive. So, you know, if we can redevelop dispersal through connecting landscapes together or connecting habitat patches together, restore disturbance processes or natural processes and recreate that diversity, then we can rewild our landscapes. And you can see what that means there. So this is not about going back to some sort of imagined past. This is about moving ourselves forward. This is John Muir's idea about stitching the universe back together. We don't know what will happen, you know, especially in an era of climate change. It's not clear what the outcome will be. For sure, it will be wilder. For sure, it will be more interesting, more prosperous for us. So this is a long way from traditional nature conservation. It's, you know, for most of my career has been about setting, you know, looking at a site, setting out its features of interest, working out the objectives that we're trying to meet, and then setting some managed prescriptions. No, this is not about that. It's about saying what rewilding interventions that we need to take in order to recreate trophic complexity, in order to allow dispersal, in order to allow natural processes to happen. And then we can sit back and watch the wonder of nature sort itself out and return wildlife to us, and all the benefits that will come out of that, which I'll come on to in a second. Not only that, I think this is an enormous opportunity for Europe, and just have a look at this map. So you can see that across Europe, a lot of land is now coming out of agricultural production. And it's not that agriculture is unprofitable in large parts of Europe, far from it. It's a heavily subsidized system. It's just that young people are looking at their parents who are working, have to get up really early, go to bed really late, working very hard, making very, very little money, and saying, well, why would I do that? Why don't I go and work in a normal job in the city or in the local town? I'll earn more money. I don't have to work in the evening. I don't have to work at the weekend. I have a better quality of life. And so, so younger people are not taking up their parents' farming, and the land is being not used for agriculture anymore. And in one sense, of course, that's fantastic for wildlife, and we're seeing a massive comeback for wildlife. I'll show you that later on. In another sense, of course, that's disastrous for rural economies. The loss of young people, the loss of enterprises, schools start to shut down, post offices shut down, and so on. So we need to start thinking about, well, what do we do with that land? You know, how can we create prosperity on the back of that land? And there are huge socioeconomic impacts that can be driven out of rewilding, which I'll come on to. What's also worth mentioning at this point is just how rewilding relates to the marine environment. So if you think about the marine environment, it's quite interesting. So firstly, if you think about those three processes of disturbance, connectivity, and trophic complexity. So in terms of disturbance, the marine environment is a highly disturbed environment. So we have massive tides, we have waves ripping through, storms ripping through, and so on. So it has huge diversity, but because of that high level of natural process and disturbance. It's also a supremely connected environment. So it's very different from our land. It's very connected. It's in 3D for a start, and it's completely connected environment. What we've lost at sea is the trophic cascade, and particularly we've lost the big megafauna. But we know that we can get trophic diversity back quite quickly through things like marine protected areas, and particularly highly protected marine areas, because we know that the science says that because the diversity of the seas hasn't been lost altogether, it's not that we're dealing with extinct animals, we're dealing with animals that are rarely seen or at very, very low numbers, mainly due to fishing, industrial fishing, is we can return that diversity very quickly if we protect areas from exploitation. It's exploitation that's driven low trophic diversity, not other factors. So we can return that simply by having marine protected areas. And the scientists say that we can return that diversity quite quickly in just a generation, say 25 to 30 years, because this is a well-connected, highly disturbed, highly mobile habitats. So that's quite interesting. It's also worth saying that that when I talk about rewilding, I'm not talking about a replacement for traditional nature conservation. I'm just talking about a slightly different approach. So we know how to rebuild the biodiversity of our land. We've been doing it for decades. This is just a sort of typical example, really. So here's a nature reserve, or now a nature reserve in East Yorkshire called Skern Wetlands, and it was a fish farm. You can see all the pools that we use for an intensive fish farm. That fish farm was polluting the adjacent Triple S, a site of special scientific interest, important for wildlife, chalk stream. It's the most northerly chalk stream in Britain. And so we've restored that fish farm, or Yorkshire Wildlife Trust have restored that fish farm and created a beautiful nature reserve. And there's Esting Marsh Harry there. It's fantastic. But at what cost? So you can see some of the problems we've got there. So firstly, it's a pretty expensive process. So we have a full-time member of staff. We've got all our management objectives. So a full-time member of staff working on that. And then we've got about 30 or 40 volunteers. So that's a pretty expensive operation for just 40 hectares of land. That 40 hectares of land, as you can see, is an island of quite nice biodiversity sitting within a sea of intensive arable landscape with very little wildlife in it. And we know we're always going to be up against it because of that. A rewilding approach would have taken a slightly different approach and said, well, what are the natural processes that we can reinstate here, and then not set an objective to allow that to come back, allow the wildlife to come back. And we can see that wildlife coming back at scale across, especially continental Europe, not so much in the UK. And this is because of this cessation of agriculture in many parts of Europe, but also because of the Birds and Habitats Directive reducing persecution of some of the big animals. So you can see the sort of numbers that are starting to happen here. So, for example, beavers in 1970, there were just 75,000 beavers across the European continent. By 2003, that's up to 340,000 beavers. It's probably at least 500,000 beavers by today. We're going to redo this report next year. And what does 500,000 beavers mean? Well, if most beavers produce at least 2 dams, so that's 1 million dams. That's 1 million wetlands across Europe. So that's an enormous expansion of wetland biodiversity across Europe simply because of the comeback of beaver. We can see, for example, the ecology of fear creating that trophic cascade as wolves return. So in 1970, just 4,000 wolves left on the European continent, almost extinct. By 2012, up to 12,000 wolves. There's a lot more today, and they're back everywhere. They're even back in Belgium. There's only one country in Europe where wolves haven't returned, and that is, of course, the UK. Can we see a similar comeback of wildlife here in our United Kingdom? Well, yeah, I think we can. We've seen, for example, the efforts that have been put into, for example, red kite reintroduction. So we've reintroduced red kite various parts of the British Isles, and they're gradually spreading across the UK. So for me in Yorkshire, they're reintroduced near Leeds, and they're now regularly seen in York and east of York. Fantastic. But for me, that the bird of prey wildlife comeback, that's even more impressive, is buzzards. So you lucky lot in Devon will have been seeing buzzards throughout your lifetime. But I grew up in Eastern England, and there was not a buzzard to be seen in Eastern England throughout the whole of my childhood, early 20s, most of my 30s. But in my 40s and my 50s, buzzards have returned to Eastern England, and they've returned at scale. They're really common. They're seen everywhere, all over the UK. And that's simply through reduced persecution. We've reintroduced beavers into Knapdale, for example, in southwest Scotland. But the real story of beaver reintroduction is what's happened in the River Tay catchment, where a few beavers were released and they're now abundant in the River Tay. It's abundant to the point where the farmers have actually persuaded Scottish Natural Heritage to start slaughtering the population again. Can you believe it? I've seen wild beavers in Welsh river valleys, and of course you have beavers in the River Otter catchment. So we just need to let that wildlife comeback happen. So Scottish Natural Heritage, don't shoot beavers, move them to somewhere else. And out of this wildlife comeback, out of this return of wildlife, the rewilding of the European landscapes where it's happening, we can start to see some of these socioeconomic opportunities start to develop. So I can talk about ecosystem services, those natural services, clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration to solve climate change, flood prevention, drought control, the sort of things we saw in the Netherlands flood valleys, but also new enterprises, and particularly in the field of nature tourism. And tourism is important, A, because it's a big sector, it's a big part of our economy, and of the tourism sector. Nature tourism is one of the fastest growing parts of that tourism sector. It's also important because tourism is mainly created by lots of micro enterprises, and micro enterprises are important in terms of economic development because they allow money to circulate around the local area. They create more multiplier effect. They're longer lasting. They employ more people, and they have greater effect in a local area. So we can see that as wildlife comes back, there's a new use for these landscapes that are once agricultural. There's a new use that can start to develop greater prosperity, start to return some of those rural traditions, younger people back into those rural landscapes, promote the cultural values, and so on. And just to give you an example of that, Devon example, so salt marsh is a good example. So we can start talking about the ecosystem services of salt marsh, not least carbon sequestration that reduces the impact of climate change, because for sure climate change is having a massive impact on the North Devon coast. And you can see the sort of impact there. So if you've got salt marsh in front of your house, that's a really good thing, because where those storm waves come across salt marsh, the roughness of the salt marsh surface reduces those storm waves, and by the time they get to your house, they're going to be much, much less damaging. And you really don't want waves like you can see in that picture hitting your house. So we can spend money, we can spend huge amounts of money on seawalls, on sea defences, that's very expensive, or we can allow natural processes to return salt marshes, mudflats, and so on. And of course it's much, much cheaper, and it has a whole bunch of other different services. So rewilding is a new conservation narrative. It's about a new appreciation of wilder nature. It's about restoring wildlife from natural processes, not from conservation objectives, but looking at the natural, reinstating natural processes. It's a progressive approach. It's about moving forward into a climate altered future. It's using nature as an ally to solve some of those issues around, for example, increased storminess, or climate change, or increased flooding, and so on. It's also fantastically cost effective. So, when we talk about, for example, carbon capture and storage, and there's a lot of different technological solutions that have been proposed to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it underground, or store it somewhere. But they're incredibly expensive. And yet on the hills in the UK, we have blanket bogs. They've been doing this for thousands of years. They are a carbon capture and storage system. So let's restore those blanket bog systems to create our natural carbon capture and storage systems. It's so much cheaper. So it's all very well to talk about all these different examples, or the theory of rewilding, and try to get across to you that I think it's a really exciting new narrative. But what about action on the ground? And we often talk about ourselves as sort of head in the sky but boots on the ground. And so what I want to do is just give you a few examples of rewilding in practice. I'm going to start in northern Portugal, and this is in the Coa Valley. And you can see here some rock art from the Mesolithic hunters that were active in this area 10,000 years ago. And you can see the sort of animals that they were hunting here. So here's a beautiful picture of an auroch, which is wild cattle. You see its big horns, that big nose, and so on. And there's also things like wild horses, wild goats, and so on in this picture. This is the important wildlife that they were hunting at that time. And this is what the landscape looks like today. So it's still a partly cultural landscape. There's still some cultivation happening, terraces on the hills. And you can see that the lower terraces here are still in production. So olive oil, olive trees in production. But the vast majority of the Coa Valley landscape is now being abandoned for agriculture. It's simply, the soils are too thin and too degraded to allow agriculture to continue. And there's a massive depopulation of that landscape. So it's effectively an abandoned landscape with a little bit of agriculture hanging on there. So what's our vision for the Coa Valley? This is the sort of vision that we can consider. So if we restored some of the natural processes into that system, that's mostly about restoring the big mega herbivores, so wild cattle, wild horses, and so on, encouraging the carnivores to come back. We've already got wolves and lynx in the area, but they can come back in bigger numbers, encouraging the scavengers to come back, the vultures and so on. Look at what you get. It's a bit like a Serengeti in Europe. Fantastic. So we're starting to introduce some of those animals. So here's Taurus, which is a wild cattle equivalent. So the Taurus Foundation in the Netherlands is backbreeding the primitive breeds of cattle across Europe to create something that's physically and in DNA terms very similar to auroch. We don't call it an auroch because we'll never get back to the original auroch, but we can get pretty close. And we're using primitive breeds of horses. In the Iberian case, Patoka horses, but in the British case, Exmoor ponies. So we can reintroduce some of those animals in there. And then at the same time, then we can create the socioeconomic advantages of rewilding. So we can start to develop, rather than fly to Africa to see these fantastic landscapes full of incredible animals, we can see that here in Europe. It's much quicker and easier to get to Portugal. And so we can start to develop things like, luxury accommodation, or here's a sort of African safari camp type experience being developed in the Coa Valley. We call it the Star Camp. And you can see what a fantastic place to spend the night, eat fantastic food and see this incredible wildlife around you. That's just one example. Let's move across into Croatia. Beautiful set of hills paralleling the Croatian coast in the Adriatic Sea. Called the Velebit Mountains. Absolutely fantastic. Two national parks at either end, but in between it's a nicely forested area, but it's heavily hunted, and wildlife populations are very low. So we've actually bought some of those hunting concessions, and what we're trying to do is to encourage people to shoot photographs rather than shoot animals, and in that way we can bring the animal populations up. That's actually good for hunting because hunters, obviously, it makes it easier to hunt. So there's more animals to hunt. So there's an advantage for the hunters. So it's just very much working alongside hunting, but also is, of course, fantastic for nature tourism. And so we're starting to see what is actually quite a poor area of the coast, poor area of Croatia, starting to see a return of tourists into that, or at the beginning of tourists into that area. So a huge amount of tourism along the Adriatic coast, coastal tourism. Let's bring some of those visitors into the inland and have a look at the fantastic wildlife that is starting to bound back in those hunting concessions that we've taken over. This is another lovely example. So the Danube Delta, fantastic delta on the Romanian-Ukraine-Moldovan border. And the Danube Delta was largely turned over to agriculture in Soviet times. So it was drained. It was turned into mainly arable agriculture, very expensive, required a huge amount of labor. And when communism collapsed in 1989, a lot of that land was then abandoned. So it's no longer used for agriculture, or some of it's still used for a bit of pasture. And so what WWF and our partners, Rewilding Ukraine, are doing is starting to remove the banks to allow the rivers to, the deltaic rivers of the Danube in that case, start to reconnect with the delta floodplain area. And that agricultural land is starting to redevelop its old reed system and so on. And into that landscape, we can then introduce the mega herbivores, so wild horses, conic ponies in that case, water buffalo, first time water buffalo been back in Europe for many thousands of years. And on the steppe areas, the dry areas of the delta, we're reintroducing European wild ass again. The first time they've been back in Europe, Kulan they're called. I never even knew there was a European wild ass species. And they're being redeveloped in there. And again, what we can then do is redevelop the rural economy through nature tourism. So what we're seeing is, for example, local fishermen are now making more money taking tourists around and showing them some of the incredible wildlife of the Danube Delta, pelicans, some of these big animals and so on. They make more money from that than they do from fishing. And because they're making more money from being nature guides than fishing, the fish populations of the delta is starting to rebound as fishing reduces slightly. And that's allowing bigger populations of things like pelican to come in. So it's a beautiful win-win example of what's possible in that sort of coastal situation. Here's another example in the Central Apennines. It's one of my areas in Italy. And again, what we're trying to do here is that we have a very, very rare subspecies of European brown bear, Masterton brown bear or Apennine brown bear. There's only 60 of these animals left, so they're teetering on the edge of extinction. And they sit in just one national park, the Abruzzo National Park in the central Apennines. And again, this is an area of massive agricultural abandonment. So only an hour and a half from Rome, it's very easy to get to, beautiful mountains, but massive rural depopulation and rural poverty. And so we're looking at, well, how can we expand the mask and brown bear population and start to create that new economy? So what we're doing there is we're creating these coexistence corridors. We call them bear smart communities, where we're encouraging people to not only cope with bears in their around their villages and so on, but actually see it as a massive positive, because bears creates interest, creates nature tourism, creates economy, returns young people into that landscape, creates new prosperity for what is currently a declining, economically declining area. And imagine, only an hour and a half from Rome, you could see bears, you can see wolves, you can see chamois, you can see vultures overhead and so on. It's a really exciting project. A similar project in the Southern Carpathians. So here, beautiful beech woods stretching across the Carpathian chain, but have lost one of their mega herbivores, European bison. So European bison down to just 52 animals in the late 1920s, been a captive breeding program ever since. We're now just beginning to return European bison at scale into the European landscape. So they've been returned into the wilderness in places like Poland and Belarus for some years. And here we are returning bison into Romania for the first time for 300 years. They were extirpated from Romania 300 years ago. And that's then using bison as the sort of kind of mega herbivore icon of a new nature economy in that area, what is a very poor area of Europe. So out of all these different examples, I've got kind of 6 key messages that I want to take you through. So the first big message is that this is about reintroducing natural processes. So we've lost some of these natural processes many thousands of years. You know, in the UK, we don't have the natural processes of, for example, wild boar or beavers or the big mega herbivores. So if we can start to reintroduce those animals into our landscape, and this applies just as much at sea as on the landscape, then we can allow natural processes to allow nature to come back. We don't fix the outcome, we let nature decide. That's our first big message. The second big message is happening. It's happening in Europe. And I've just loved some of these numbers. So who would have thought that there's more wolves in Europe than there are in North America? There's far more bears in Europe than there are in North America. So even though we have more people in Europe than in North America, we can see this wildlife comeback happening. The British Isles, of course, is lagging behind, but maybe those socioeconomic conditions are starting to fall into place. We know that in the uplands of the UK, farming is, even with subsidy, already uneconomic, and a Brexit, even a soft Brexit, would probably be the final nail in the coffin, for example, in the coffin, for example, for sheep farming. And then we start to think about, well, how can we revitalize that rural economy through, for example, rewilding? My third big message, it's starting to happen, you know, so we can see this happening across various countries. So here's some country initiatives that have been set up. Here in the UK, we have Rewilding Britain, Rewilding Portugal, Rewilding Sweden, Rewilding UK, and so on. We can see new initiatives starting to develop. So we're starting to develop rewilding initiatives in both France, Spain, and Finland. We have landscape level initiatives. Some of those are mentioned in the Apennines, in the Danube Delta, and so on. And there's a new program called the Endangered Landscape Program, which is about trying to encourage rewilding particular landscapes. And we've got a couple of examples here in the UK, one in the Cairngorms and one in Wales, which is not working so well, actually, for reasons we'll go into. Okay, my fourth big message is actually rewilding it's a new narrative, and we need European policy to catch up with this. So we're doing quite a lot of work with the European Commission to improve European policy, and it's the same in the UK. We need policy to catch up with that. So most of our policy is around trying to retain agriculture, even unprofitable agriculture on land. We need to move it so it's a more rounded approach that includes nature conservation, rewilding, climate change mitigation. And we're beginning to do that in the UK as a result of Brexit with the new agricultural bill. My fifth big message is that this is even more relevant at sea and along the coast than it is on land. You know, Nature conservation on land is difficult, particularly in the UK, because we've so fragmented our environment. But along the coast, and particularly in our marine environment, because of that connectivity, because we haven't actually lost all of the diversity, it's just at low numbers, because of the inherent natural dynamism of the coast and the marine environment, then rewilding has a particular resonance. I think that's really important in the context of North Devon, that that there's an enormous opportunity to make rewilding happen in the UK, particularly along our coastline. And of course, it's our coastlines and our marine environment that has some of the really special wildlife, globally special wildlife in the UK. My sixth and last message is around communications, really, that sometimes, and people like to polarize debates, of course, because it makes for good headlines. And there's and we've seen that rewilding in Central Wales, for example, got very polarized. And this idea that outsiders are trying to rewild and destroy the cultural local communities, and that's not really what rewilding is about at all, as I've spoken about in this discussion. Rewilding is about working with local communities to improve the quality of life and to increase prosperity, and that we can see many ways that that's possible. So it's about hope, not conflict, which is always difficult in our very polarized country that we live in. We're much more polarized in the UK than other parts of Europe. So communications is all, and it's really important that we communicate this new narrative, and we put a lot of effort into that in Europe. And I'm just going to finish. Thank you very much.